Imagine waking up tomorrow, stepping out your front door, and finding your neighborhood transformed into a freezing, barren tundra. Then, imagine that a few weeks later, it shifts again, this time into a blistering, waterless desert. You'd probably think the world was ending. But for our ancient ancestors living in East Africa around 2 million years ago, this kind of profound environmental chaos wasn't the apocalypse. It was the ultimate test. And passing that test required building the most expensive, high-maintenance, and fragile piece of biological real estate on the planet, a bigger brain. Welcome to the incredible, chaotic story of Homo erectus, the ancient human species that walked out of the evolutionary shadows and quite literally changed the shape of our minds. Today, we are going to dive deep into a period of extreme, violent climate shifts that completely rewrote the rules of survival. By the end of this journey, you'll see exactly how dodging apocalyptic weather didn't just keep our ancestors alive. It supersized their brains and set the stage for you, me, and everyone currently walking the earth. Let's rewind the clock to roughly 2 million years ago. If you were to spot a Homo erectus standing in the distance, you might actually mistake them for a modern human, at least from the neck down. They were tall, they had long legs built for endurance running, and they had finally lost the long tree-climbing arms of their predecessors. They were built for the ground. But from the neck up, that is where the real revolution was happening, and it was happening fast. Before Homo erectus, earlier hominins like Australopithecus had brains roughly the size of a modern chimpanzee's, hovering around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters. But Homo erectus breaks onto the scene with a brain size starting around 600 cubic centimeters, which then violently explodes up to 1,000 cubic centimeters over their reign on Earth. That is a massive, unprecedented jump. It is the evolutionary equivalent of upgrading from a basic pocket calculator to a high-end smartphone in the blink of an eye. But here is the catch about big brains. They are absolute energy hogs. To put things in perspective, your modern human brain makes up only about 2% of your total body weight, but it demands 20% of your daily caloric intake just to keep the lights on. Evolutionary biology has a very strict, highly unforgiving accounting department. Nature does not hand out expensive, energy-draining organs just for fun. You do not get a massive brain unless you desperately, fundamentally need it to survive. So, what was the pressure? What on earth was happening 2 million years ago that forced nature to sign off on this massive biological upgrade? For a very long time, the classic textbook answer was surprisingly simple. You might have even learned it in school. It was called the savanna hypothesis. The story went like this. The lush African forests slowly dried up. Vast, open, grassy savannas took their place, and our ancestors were forced out of the trees. To survive in the tall grass alongside massive, terrifying predators, they had to stand up straight, get smart, and learn to hunt. It makes for a nice, tidy, linear story. A beautiful A to B narrative. There is just one massive problem with it. The dirt beneath our feet tells a completely different, far more terrifying story. When modern geologists and paleoclimatologists started drilling deep into the mud of ancient African lake beds and analyzing ocean floor sediment, they were looking for evidence of this slow, steady drying phase. Instead, they found a climate record that looked like an erratic heartbeat. The environment wasn't just doing a slow fade from forest to grassland. It was swinging wildly. We are talking about severe, whiplash-inducing shifts. Deep, massive freshwater lakes would fill vast basins, creating lush paradises, and then, within the span of just a few thousand years, they would evaporate entirely, leaving behind brutal, blinding dust bowls. And then, the lakes would come back. Over and over again. The tectonic plates beneath the African Rift Valley were shifting, changing the topography and throwing local weather systems into absolute chaos. Our ancestors weren't just dealing with a new environment. They were dealing with an environment that refused to pick a lane. And this terrifying realization completely shattered the old theories of human evolution. Because if the world around you is constantly pulling the rug out from under your feet, the old rules of survival no longer apply. Think about how evolution normally operates. In most cases, nature heavily rewards the specialists. If you are a koala, Your entire existence is perfectly optimized for sitting in a eucalyptus tree and chewing toxic leaves. If you are a polar bear, you are an absolute masterclass in surviving sub-zero temperatures on floating sea ice. Becoming a specialist is usually a fantastic survival strategy, until the environment changes. If the eucalyptus trees die, or the sea ice melts, the specialist is doomed. Their bodies are built for a world that no longer exists. During this era of intense climate whiplash in ancient Africa, a lot of specialized animals went completely extinct. In fact, Homo erectus had a distant evolutionary cousin living right alongside them. Scientists call them Paranthropus boisei, but they are often nicknamed the Nutcracker Man. These guys took the specialist route. As the climate shifted and food got tough, they evolved massive, heavily muscled jaws and gigantic, flat teeth to grind up hard roots, nuts, and low-quality vegetation. For a while, it worked brilliantly. But when the climate swung again, and those specific tough plants disappeared, the Nutcracker Man couldn't adapt. They went extinct. Homo erectus, on the other hand, survived. And they didn't do it by evolving bigger teeth, thicker fur, or longer claws. They did it by adopting a revolutionary new survival strategy proposed by paleoanthropologist Rick Potts. It's called the Variability Selection Hypothesis. This hypothesis completely flips the script on human evolution. It suggests that our ancestors weren't evolving to fit into one specific environment, like a forest or a savanna. Instead, the wild, unpredictable climate forced them to evolve an adaptation to change itself. Nature was no longer selecting for the best tree climber or the fastest runner. It was selecting for the ultimate biological generalist. It was selecting for flexibility. Picture what this looked like on the ground. One generation of early humans might be born on the edge of a massive, sprawling lake system in the Rift Valley. They grow up navigating dense, green woodlands, gathering fruit, and finding water easily. Life is relatively stable. But skip forward a few dozen generations, and a subtle shift in the Earth's orbit has completely altered the African monsoon cycle. Now those descendants are staring at a cracked, bone-dry desert. The lakes have vanished into dust, the fruit trees are dead, and the herds of grazing animals have scattered. If you are a physical specialist, you die. But if you have the beginnings of a larger, more complex brain, you can solve the problem in real time. You don't have to wait millions of years for evolution to give you a camel's hump to store water. You can use your mind to remember where a hidden underground spring was located during the last dry season. You can use your hands to dig for it. You can observe the flight patterns of birds to figure out where the last remaining water holes are. A bigger brain acts like a biological shock absorber. It buffers you against the chaos of the world. It allows you to hold mental maps, track time, understand animal behavior, and predict seasonal changes. In short, it replaces instinct with raw intelligence. But this incredible, flexible software update came with a catch that we mentioned earlier. The brain is a greedy, energy-guzzling engine. You cannot power a massive, complex brain on a diet of low-calorie leaves, tough twigs, and the occasional handful of berries. That is exactly what our earlier ancestors survived on, but it simply wasn't going to cut it for Homo erectus. To survive the climate whiplash, they needed their big brains. But to power those big brains, they needed to find a completely new, high-octane fuel source. And finding that fuel in a landscape that was constantly trying to starve them meant Homo erectus was about to kick off the most intense nutritional arms race in the history of the planet. So, what exactly is the ultimate high-octane fuel in a chaotic, drying African landscape? It isn't a tough, fibrous root. It's meat. More specifically, it is fat and protein. To power their rapidly expanding brains, Homo erectus had to make a massive dietary leap. But let's be brutally honest for a second. If you were dropped onto the ancient African plains armed only with a sharpened rock, you probably aren't taking down a charging wildebeest. And neither were they, at least, not in the very beginning. Early Homo erectus were likely not the apex predators we like to imagine. They were the ultimate opportunists. They were scavengers. Picture this scene. A massive saber-toothed cat takes down an antelope, eats its fill of the soft organs, and leaves the rest of the carcass to rot under the blazing sun. Vultures and giant hyenas move in. Suddenly, a coordinated group of Homo erectus charges out of the brush. They are waving sticks, shouting, throwing heavy rocks and acting just crazy enough to drive the terrifying predators away. But what's actually left to eat? Usually, just a stripped rib cage and some incredibly thick leg bones. This is exactly where their growing brains and their stone tools gave them a biological cheat code. Using a heavy, rounded rock, they could smash open those thick femurs and access the hidden treasure inside: bone marrow. Bone marrow is incredibly calorie-dense, absolutely packed with the pure fat and rich nutrients a growing brain desperately craves. It was essentially the prehistoric equivalent of a high-calorie protein shake, locked away inside a biological safe that only a hominin with a tool could open. But shifting to a diet heavier in meat and marrow introduced a massive biological dilemma, one that modern anthropologists call the expensive tissue hypothesis. Here is the problem. You have two organs in your body that demand staggering amounts of energy: your brain and your digestive system. A long, complex intestinal tract requires a massive blood supply and huge amounts of energy to slowly break down tough, toxic plant matter. But nature operates on a strict, unforgiving energy budget. You simply cannot have both a massive, energy-draining gut and a massive, energy-draining brain. You would starve to death trying to feed both. So a profound evolutionary trade-off occurred. Because meat and fat are densely packed with calories and much easier to digest than pounds of fibrous leaves, our ancestors didn't need 80 feet of complex intestines anymore. Slowly, over thousands of generations, our guts shrank. And as the digestive system dialed back its extreme energy demands, that surplus fuel was redirected upstairs, straight into building a bigger, infinitely more complex brain. We essentially traded our big bellies for big minds. And here is where the whiplash climate comes roaring back into the story. When those lush African lake basins suddenly dried up into brutal dust bowls, the fruit trees died, the edible plants vanished. If your digestive system was only built to process specific plants, you went extinct. But if you had adapted to eat meat and scavenge marrow, you could survive. The erratic climate forced Homo erectus to become a dietary generalist, perfectly adapted to eat whatever the unpredictable earth served up. But raw meat and marrow were only step one. The true revolution, the absolute game changer, that completely severed our ties to the rest of the animal kingdom, was fire. We don't know exactly when or how it happened. Maybe a lightning strike started a massive bushfire, and a curious Homo erectus tasted a roasted animal left behind in the smoking ashes. But however it began, learning to control fire changed absolutely everything about the human trajectory. Think about the physical act of cooking. When you drop a tough root or a piece of raw meat into a fire, the intense heat breaks down the tough cell walls and denatures the complex proteins. Fire essentially pre-digests your food for you before it even enters your mouth. To put this in perspective, modern apes like gorillas spend up to 8 hours a day just chewing. 8 hours! Their massive jaws and heavy neck muscles are constantly working just to extract enough meager calories from raw plants to keep their bodies alive. If you tried to power your modern, brain-heavy body on a raw, wild ape diet, you would literally spend your entire waking life chewing. By cooking their food, Homo erectus unlocked a massive, unprecedented surplus of easily absorbable calories. The energy yield from a cooked meal is astronomically higher than a raw one. Suddenly, they didn't have to spend half their day chewing tough leaves. They had free time, and they had unprecedented amounts of surplus energy flowing directly to their brains. Fire didn't just keep the terrifying Ice Age predators away in the dark. It became the external stomach of humanity, literally cooking up the biological fuel required to make us who we are. With their guts shrinking, their brains expanding, and the power of fire flickering in their camps, Homo erectus was no longer just reacting to the unpredictable climate. They were beginning to outsmart it. With their bodies fueled by this cooked, calorie-dense diet, the minds of Homo erectus didn't just grow larger in volume, they grew fundamentally, structurally different. The chaotic, swinging climate of the African Rift Valley had provided the pressure, and meat and fire had provided the fuel. Now, the final product was stepping onto the prehistoric stage, armed with a cognitive ability that no other creature on Earth possessed. To understand just how radical this mental upgrade was, you only need to look at their garbage, or more accurately, their discarded toolkits. Millions of years earlier, hominins were already using stone tools. But those early tools were incredibly basic. Essentially, an ancient ancestor would smash one river rock against another to knock off a few sharp flakes, and use whatever jagged edge resulted to scrape a bone. It was practical, but it was purely reactive. It didn't require much imagination. But Homo erectus created something entirely different. They invented what archaeologists often call the ultimate Paleolithic Swiss Army knife, the Acheulean hand axe. Picture a perfectly symmetrical, teardrop-shaped piece of stone, carefully chipped on both sides to create a razor-sharp edge that converges at a pointed tip. These hand axes fit perfectly in the palm of a hand. They were used to butcher large animals, slice through tough hides, chop wood, and dig for water. They were absolute masterpieces of ancient engineering. But the true significance of the hand axe isn't what it was used for. It's what it reveals about the brain of the person who made it. To create a symmetrical hand axe, you cannot just randomly bash rocks together. Before you even strike the first blow, you have to hold a clear, three-dimensional image of the finished tool in your mind's eye. You have to look at a raw, unshaped lump of flint and see the axe hidden inside it. You have to plan ahead, understanding exactly which angle to strike and how much force to use, anticipating how the stone will fracture. This requires a massive leap in executive function, spatial awareness, and forward planning. Homo erectus was no longer just reacting to the world around them. They were projecting their imagination onto the physical world, imposing their mental will onto nature. This level of abstract thinking points to a profound development: neuroplasticity. The erratic whiplash climate didn't just select for a big brain, it selected for a brain that was highly adaptable, capable of rewiring itself to learn completely new skills. When the local environment abruptly transformed from a wetland paradise into a blinding desert, a rigid, instinct-driven mind would panic and perish. But a highly plastic mind would observe the new conditions, experiment with new materials, and invent a new solution. But this incredible cognitive flexibility came with one final, dangerous evolutionary trade-off. Because the human brain is so massive and complex, it cannot fully grow inside the womb. If a prehistoric baby were born with a fully developed brain, its head would be too large to pass through the birth canal. As a result, Homo erectus infants had to be born neurologically premature. Unlike a baby horse that can stand and run within hours of birth, early human babies were completely helpless for years. This extended childhood was a massive liability in a predator-filled, climate-ravaged world. A crying, defenseless toddler requires constant protection and feeding. But evolution turned this liability into our greatest superpower. To keep these helpless infants alive while their big brains slowly wired themselves up, Homo erectus had to develop intense, complex social cooperation. You cannot survive an apocalyptic, multi-generational drought if your tribe is constantly turning on each other to fight over the last scrap of scavenged meat. You survive by forming deep emotional bonds. You survive by reading subtle facial expressions, sharing resources, dividing labor, and looking out for the sick and the young. This is the climax of the human evolutionary story. The extreme climate of the African Rift Valley was essentially a high-pressure forge. It hammered our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years, wiping out the specialists and the inflexible. What walked out of that forge wasn't a creature adapted to a specific forest, or a specific savanna, or a specific desert. It was a creature adapted to each other. They had forged a collective, flexible intelligence that could look at any environment, no matter how harsh or unfamiliar, and figure out a way to conquer it. And with this newly minted, wildly adaptable mind, Homo erectus was about to do something no hominin had ever dared to do before. They were about to start walking, and they weren't going to stop until they reached the edge of the world. They walked out of the Great Rift Valley, out of the African continent entirely, and stepped into the complete unknown. Over the next million years, Homo erectus pushed into environments that would have terrified their ancestors. They left their footprints in the freezing, wind-swept mountains of the Caucasus in modern-day Georgia. They navigated the arid deserts of the Middle East, and they pushed deep into the steamy, humid jungles of Southeast Asia. Every other animal that migrated across such vastly different ecosystems had to wait millions of years to physically evolve, to grow thick winter fur, or specialized cooling mechanisms, or different digestive tracts. Not Homo erectus. They simply packed up their Acheulean hand axes, carried the embers of their fires, and adapted on the fly. They were the ultimate biological pioneers, conquering the globe not with physical strength, but with culture, cooperation, and a highly adaptable mind. When you look back at the grand story of human evolution, it is easy to view extreme climate change as the villain. But the truth is, the very chaos that constantly threatened to wipe our ancestors out is exactly what forged us. Without those apocalyptic droughts and the terrifying whiplash weather of the ancient world, our ancestors might have just stayed comfortably in the forests, perfectly adapted to a life of chewing leaves, forever. We owe our entire existence, our art, our sprawling cities, our modern technology, and the very ability to comprehend our own history, to that brutal, unforgiving crucible of prehistoric climate change. Today, we find ourselves standing on the edge of our own era of rapid, extreme environmental shifts. The deep irony, of course, is that this time, the chaos isn't being driven by a shifting tectonic plate or a random wobble in the Earth's orbit. It's being driven by us, the very same big, energy-hungry brains that saved our species 2 million years ago have built a modern, industrialized world that is currently testing our survival limits all over again. So, the ultimate question is this: do we still have that ancient, deep-seated ability to cooperate, adapt, and invent our way out of a shifting climate? Or have our massive brains finally created a problem that even we cannot solve? Think about that the next time you find yourself staring into the flames of a campfire. I would love to hear your thoughts on this down in the comments. Do you think our ancestors would be proud of the world they fought so hard to set in motion? If you enjoyed this deep dive into our ancient past, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with a fellow history nerd. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never forget where you came from.